Ed Gein. On an isolated Wisconsin farm, a boy grew up under the crushing weight of a mother who preached that all women, herself excluded, were vessels of sin. Isolated from other children, Ed absorbed every word. When his mother died in 1945, something inside him didn't grieve. It unraveled. Alone on the farm, he began exhuming graves, driven by an obsession with recreating her presence, piece by gruesome piece. In November 1957, a hardware store owner vanished. Police followed the trail to Gaines' farmhouse, where they found a scene so disturbing it would haunt investigators for the rest of their careers and inspire fiction for decades. Declared unfit for trial, Gein was committed to a mental institution rather than sentenced. He spent the rest of his life confined, calm, and cooperative, a chilling contrast to the horror he'd created. In 1984, at 77, Ed Gein died quietly of respiratory and heart failure in a state hospital bed. No trial, no execution. Just an old man fading away, decades after inspiring Norman Bates, Leatherface, and Buffalo Bill, Dennis Nilsen. A lonely Scottish boy grew up haunted by the sight of his grandfather's corpse, the first dead body he ever loved. That image, tender and terrifying, would quietly shape everything that came after. In London, Nilsen was crushingly alone. Starting in 1978, he began inviting young men into his flat for company. Men who would never leave. He kept their bodies close, unwilling to let the silence return. For years, Nilsen killed and kept his victims hidden beneath his floorboards, occasionally sitting with them for company. His undoing wasn't a witness or a slip of the tongue. It was his plumbing, clogged with human remains. In 1983, a drain repairman found flesh in the pipes outside Nilsen's home. Police arrived expecting a routine call. Nilsen answered the door and, without hesitation, confessed to killing at least 12 men. Sentenced to life, Nilsen spent 35 years behind bars, writing an unpublished memoir. In May 2018, he died of natural causes in prison, a quiet, unremarkable end for a man once called Britain's most disturbing killer, Charles Manson. Born to a teenage mother in Cincinnati, Charles Manson spent his childhood shuffled between relatives and reformatories, absorbing rejection like a second skin, and learning, early, how to manipulate for survival. By the late 1960s, Manson had built something stranger than a gang, a family. In the California desert, he gathered disillusioned young followers, convincing them he was a prophet with a war to start. In August 1969, Manson's followers carried out the Tate LaBianca murders on his command, believing they were igniting an apocalyptic race war. Manson himself never wielded the knife. His weapon was belief. Arrested later that year on unrelated charges, Manson was soon linked to the murders through his followers' own testimony. The trial became a media spectacle, ending in convictions and death sentences later commuted to life. Manson spent nearly 50 years in prison, his name becoming shorthand for cult manipulation. In November 2017, at 83, he died of natural causes tied to colon cancer. The puppet master finally out of strings, Carl Eugene Watts. In Michigan, a quiet, athletic teenager harbored violent fantasies he later admitted began in childhood. By his college years, the impulses had already turned real, though few around him suspected a thing. Watts began attacking women in the 1970s, later claiming he needed to kill to cleanse them of evil he believed he saw in their eyes. He moved between states, leaving a trail investigators struggled to connect. By the early 1980s in Texas, Watts had killed repeatedly, evading capture through sheer unpredictability. No pattern, no signature, just sudden, senseless violence against women who crossed his path. In 1982, 2 off-duty officers spotted him breaking into a home and watched him flee a scene. A plea deal, one of the most controversial in criminal history, sent him to prison for a fraction of his true toll. Released decades later, Watts was quickly rearrested after new charges surfaced. In September 2007, he died in prison of prostate cancer, having confessed, by the end, to killing more than 80 people. Richard Ramirez. Raised in El Paso under the shadow of a cousin's grim Vietnam War stories and Polaroids, young Richard developed a fascination with violence that calcified into something far darker as he drifted into drugs and crime. By 1984, Ramirez had moved to Los Angeles and begun a campaign of terror, breaking into homes at night and attacking residents at random. His crimes were chaotic, brutal, and utterly without pattern. That was the horror. Through 1985, an entire city lived in fear as the Night Stalker struck again and again. Gun shops sold out. Locksmiths worked around the clock. No neighborhood, rich or poor, felt safe from him. After his photo hit every front page, Ramirez was recognized on a Los Angeles street. A crowd of residents chased him down and beat him before police arrived. The city finally striking back. Sentenced to death, Ramirez spent over 2 decades on death row, married, and gave interviews. In June 2013, he died of complications from cancer before California ever carried out his execution. Peter Sutcliffe. A shy, awkward boy in a working-class Yorkshire family, Peter Sutcliffe grew into a gravedigger and truck driver, quietly nursing a growing hatred that would eventually make him one of Britain's most feared men. Beginning in 1975, Sutcliffe attacked women across northern England, often at night, using a hammer and knife. Each attack fed a manhunt that grew larger and more desperate as the death toll climbed. For 5 years, England lived under a curfew of fear. Sutcliffe was interviewed by police 9 separate times during the investigation, and released each time, slipping through the largest manhunt in British history. In January 1981, a routine traffic stop for false plates unraveled everything. Officers found tools in his car consistent with the attacks, and Sutcliffe finally confessed to 13 murders. Diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and confined to a secure hospital, then prison, Sutcliffe lived for decades behind walls. In November 2020, he died after contracting COVID-19, one of the pandemic's grimmest footnotes. Belle Gunness. Immigrating from Norway to the American Midwest, Belle Gunness built a reputation as a hardworking widow and mother, a reputation that concealed a string of suspicious fires and deaths, trailing her for years. On her Indiana farm, Gunness placed lonely hearts ads seeking suitors with money. Men arrived eager to court her, and one by one, they vanished. Their savings gone, their bodies buried beneath her hog pen. For years, Gunness lured suitors to her farm, killing an estimated dozens of victims, all while neighbors saw only a respectable, industrious woman raising her children alone. In April 1908, her farmhouse burned to the ground. A headless female body was found inside. But its size didn't match Gunness, fueling suspicion she'd staged her own death and vanished for good. No conviction ever came because no one could prove she was dead. Alleged sightings trickled in for decades. Belle Gunness remains one of America's few serial killers whose true fate was never confirmed. Fred West. Raised in rural Gloucestershire in a family later described as deeply abusive, Fred West left home young, drifting through odd jobs and relationships marked by violence long before his crimes became public. With his wife Rosemary, West began abducting, torturing, and killing young women in the 1970s, burying many beneath their own home at 25 Cromwell Street, a house that became a tomb hidden in plain sight. Over 2 decades, the Wests killed at least 12 victims, including their own daughter, while maintaining an outward appearance of an ordinary, if eccentric, working family in Gloucester. In 1994, a tip about their missing daughter led police to excavate the garden. What they unearthed shocked the nation and led to Fred West's arrest, along with his wife, on multiple counts of murder. Awaiting trial in January 1995, Fred West hanged himself in his cell, avoiding both testimony and verdict. Rosemary was later convicted alone, and the house itself was demolished and paved over. Israel Keyes. Raised off-grid by survivalist parents in a remote cabin, Israel Keyes was taught self-sufficiency and secrecy from childhood, skills he would later weaponize into one of the most methodical killing careers on record. Keyes buried kill kits across the country years in advance, flying to distant states, renting cars with cash, and killing strangers with no personal connection to him whatsoever. A ghost by design. For over a decade, Keyes operated undetected across multiple states, deliberately avoiding any pattern investigators could trace, priding himself on being smarter than every detective assigned to find him. In 2012, a ransom demand tied to a missing Alaska barista led investigators to Keyes through financial records. Cornered by evidence, he began confessing, but only in fragments, savoring the control it gave him. Before authorities could learn his full toll, Keyes killed himself in his cell in December 2012, slitting his wrists and strangling himself with a bedsheet, taking most of his victims' identities to the grave. H.H. Holmes. Born Herman Mudgett in New Hampshire, he was a brilliant, calculating student who became obsessed with anatomy and insurance fraud, a combination that would prove lethally profitable in adulthood. In Chicago, Holmes built a sprawling hotel laced with secret passages, gas lines, and a basement crematorium, timed to open alongside the 1893 World's Fair, when the city overflowed with strangers. During the fair, guests checked into Holmes's hotel and simply disappeared. He killed with chilling efficiency, cashing in insurance policies and selling skeletons to medical schools under false names. An insurance scam gone wrong finally caught up with him in 1894. Investigators traced his fraud, then his murders, uncovering a body count that shocked even a country accustomed to Gilded Age excess. Convicted of multiple murders, Holmes was hanged in Philadelphia in May 1896, reportedly requesting a slow-drop execution. His hotel, later called the Murder Castle, burned down under mysterious circumstances. Albert Fish. Institutionalized as a child in a Washington orphanage marked by brutal discipline, Albert Fish later described the abuse he witnessed there as something that awakened disturbing impulses he carried for life. As an adult, the mild-mannered handyman used his unassuming appearance to gain trust in New York communities, targeting children while presenting himself as a harmless, grandfatherly figure. In 1928, Fish lured a young girl from her family's apartment under a false pretense, committing a crime so horrific that its details would later stun even hardened investigators and psychiatrists. Years later, a taunting letter Fish sent to the victim's mother contained a laundry mark that police traced back to his rooming house, ending a manhunt that had gone cold for years. Despite a defense built on his documented psychiatric disturbances, Fish was convicted and executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing in January 1936, reportedly calm, even eager, in his final moments. Ted Bundy. Raised believing his mother was his sister, Bundy grew up outwardly charming and academically promising, a law student with political ambitions that masked something calculating and cold underneath. Starting in the mid-1970s, Bundy used his charisma and a fake cast or sling to lure young women to help him, then attacked across multiple states, leaving investigators struggling to believe one man was responsible. Bundy's crimes escalated in brutality and audacity, including a daylight assault at a Florida sorority house. His ability to blend into normal society made him uniquely terrifying and hard to pin down. After 2 prison escapes and further murders, Bundy was finally caught for good in 1978 following a traffic stop in Florida, evidence at last outweighing the charm that had carried him so far. Convicted and sentenced to death, Bundy confessed to dozens of murders in his final days. He was executed in Florida's electric chair in January 1989 as crowds gathered outside the prison to celebrate. John Wayne Gacy. Growing up under a harshly abusive father in Chicago, Gacy built a public persona of success and generosity. A contractor, community volunteer, and party clown named Pogo, beloved by his neighborhood. Behind the charitable image, Gacy lured young men to his home starting in the early 1970s, killing many and burying them in the crawl space beneath his house, hidden under an ordinary suburban life. Gacy's double life reached a horrifying scale. 33 known victims, while he continued performing at children's events and hosting neighborhood gatherings, utterly undetected by those closest to him. In 1978, a missing teenager was traced back to Gacy. A search of his property uncovered the crawlspace graves, exposing a suburban horror story that dominated national headlines for months. Convicted on 33 counts of murder, Gacy spent 14 years on death row, painting clown portraits from his cell. He was executed by lethal injection in May 1994, protesting his innocence to the end. Aileen Wournos. Abandoned by her mother and raised by abusive grandparents, Aileen Wournos endured a childhood of extreme trauma and homelessness, surviving on the streets of Florida from her early teenage years onward. Working as a sex worker along Florida highways in the late 1980s, Wournos began killing the men who picked her up, later claiming each killing was in self-defense against violent clients. Between 1989 and 1990, Wournos killed at least 6 men, robbing them of cash and vehicles. Her case became a media sensation, framed by some as feminist vengeance and by others as cold-blooded murder. A pawned item linked to a victim's car led police to Wournos in 1991. She confessed at length, insisting on self-defense even as prosecutors painted a portrait of premeditated killing. Convicted on multiple counts, Wournos spent a decade on death row, her mental state visibly deteriorating. She was executed by lethal injection in Florida in October 2002. Her story later dramatized in film. Jeffrey Dahmer. A withdrawn Ohio child fascinated with dead animals, Dahmer's isolation deepened through his parents' bitter divorce, and by his teenage years, disturbing impulses had already begun taking violent shape. Beginning in 1978 and escalating through the late 1980s in Milwaukee, Dahmer lured men to his apartment with promises of drinks or photographs, drugging and killing them in a private ritual of control. Dahmer's crimes grew increasingly extreme, including acts of dismemberment and cannibalism, all conducted from an ordinary apartment building while neighbors remained completely unaware of the horror next door. In July 1991, a victim escaped and flagged down police, leading them back to Dahmer's apartment. What officers found inside was so extensive it required a specialized forensic team to fully process. Sentenced to over 900 years, Dahmer was placed in general population despite the danger. In November 1994, a fellow inmate beat him to death with a weight bar, a brutal end that closed one of America's most notorious cases. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments which story surprised you the most. Thanks for watching.